Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is week 2 of our course, Intro to Music at Hillsborough Community College. And we'll get right to it. Let me first mention, though, that I still haven't heard from 10 of you. There are 14 in the class, and only 4 of you have acknowledged my emails. Also reminding you that it's a late start class. We didn't know that last week at this time. But I'm still going to proceed as if it was a regular weekly class and send these out every week. If you can email me your assignments, that would be great. But I understand if some of you can't get started until the later start. You won't be penalized for that. But please acknowledge that you've received something from me. Please send me an email. Please, 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 oh please. So let me show you where we kind of left off. Last thing we talked about, we'd listened to a piece. I'll play it for you again, but we'd listened to a piece where it got us thinking about male sopranos. It's the piece, well, let's just go ahead and listen for a second, and then we'll talk. Keyword number 1, by the way, is cashew, like the nut cashew. And this is the piece where generally when students are telling me what they hear, first thing they would say is they hear female voices. So we kind of debunked that theory, and we listed the 3 ways that you could possibly have a soprano voice and be a male. But let's also talk about another thing in the piece. Let's listen again from the beginning. Again, I'm never sure how you're hearing it and what you're hearing totally, but I hope that you hear that the one group of guys are all singing again in unison, means they're singing the exact same musical line. They're not splitting their parts at all. And then underneath that is another part, and that's what's unique about this. You know, the Middle Ages is 1,000 years, so this probably occurred after about 300 years. They decided to change it, and it's not a significant change. It goes hand in hand with the rest of the Middle Ages. It really did take 1,000 years for something significant to change in all aspects of society and culture. But there's a second part. In this case, it's actually an instrument. And there's a name for the type of sound that you hear. It's called a drone, and that's let's just put it this way, instrument. Could be more than one. So whenever you have an S like that in parentheses, basically the way I would read this sentence is instrument or instruments or voice or voices holding a sustained note beneath the other part or parts. Right now it's just one part in the male voice and then one instrument playing below. And I'm not even going to have you try to guess what the instrument is. It's actually a pipe organ, like a really fancy organ you'd see maybe in a formal traditional church. And it's just holding the note underneath, just straight across. And it never really changes, and it doesn't really involve the instrumentalist a whole lot, because I could get all of you to just come up and push a key down on the organ, and you could technically then be part of this piece of music. So there are 2 parts now, which is certainly different. And they probably were blown away by it. They listened to it and said, oh my gosh, that's incredible. To us, it doesn't sound like much, but this is the deep history and unveiling of how we got to where we are today. So now we're going to listen to the next piece, which might have been another 300 years down the road. And keyword number 2 is cement. may be impossible for you to determine exactly what's going on there, especially if you're just listening to it on a computer speaker or a phone speaker. If you do have a chance to add an auxiliary speaker, it really, really helps. I have this really great Bluetooth speaker by Sony, and that's what I play all this on, and it sounds so much better. And when I listen back to the computer, it connects via Bluetooth to my computer, and it fills the room up as big as if it were a live band almost. But it's hard to tell what you heard. In this case, there are actually 3 different parts. There are 2 men's parts, still no female voices, 2 men's parts on the top, and they're kind of split apart by this much. And they're going together up and down, but they are doing 2 separate parts. Then underneath is a 3rd part, which would be the drone holding that very, very sustained note. And it's just maybe 4 guys. You can't really tell the number, but it's more than one. Ah, while the other parts go ah, and I can't sing it up an octave. It's higher than that, but that's my voice limitations. And we're going to listen to a little bit more of it and get to the part where it changes just a little. So they changed syllables. This entire time they've been singing one syllable. The entire song is called Alleluia, similar to the first one we heard last week. And so far they've just gone ah. Now they're going le. And they're finally getting to the le part, and then it's going to be lu, and then ya. So again, historians, musicologists, archaeologists, looking at all this, we consider that to be a change. It's the first time we have 3 separate different parts, but still not yet considered a significant change. They're all starting at the same time, and they're all ending at the same time, and there's not much else going on. But it does kind of mark the end of the Middle Ages or the medieval period. So now we're going to notate the next period. Renaissance. A word you may have heard. You see Renaissance fairs sometimes in your neck of the woods. There used to be a great one up on Fowler near the University of South Florida. And so you may have actually heard of that or even been to it. Who knows? Renaissance literally means rebirth. So if you said someone today was a Renaissance man or woman or person, they would be someone that is somewhat current, but maybe a little bit old-fashioned, and they are more like a person of a long time ago. Or maybe someone with a lot of old school, or you might say OG skills. They can still change the spark plugs on a car that might have spark plugs, or change the oil, or someone that knits might be considered a Renaissance person, that sort of a thing. Now, for the first 2 changes in the historical era, I wasn't able to tell you what had changed or what had caused it to change, but now we can. This is the first era where I'm aware of the actual thing that happened, so I'm going to try to pull it out of you slowly. But around the year 1450, something was invented, and I want you to just think back, because I think most of you have heard of it. Maybe in a history class. It wouldn't be American history, it would be world history. But let's just think about it. It's not a musical invention. It's a world-changing invention. Anything come to mind? 1450. I know somebody just said it. At least I hope somebody did. It's the invention of the printing press. And we're going to actually call it the movable type printing press was invented. And the inventor's name is Gutenberg. So I'm wondering if that rings a bell at all. Movable type printing press invented by Gutenberg. So as you can well imagine, the monks in a monastery were probably, other than praying, worshiping, eating, and sleeping, their job might be full-time to write more copies of the Bible by hand. So just imagine if you had an ink pen, like a quill pen, that you had to dip in ink for almost every new letter, maybe every 2 letters it would need new ink, and you're on some piece of, old-fashioned paper. It might have been papyrus or something like that. But how long? Now, my Bible at my church, Old and New Testament, is about 850 pages in the teeniest possible little type. I mean, you almost have to use a magnifying glass. So with larger type so that you could do it easily, it could be 1,500 pages. Imagine how long that would take you with a quill pen. Certainly a year, maybe 2, maybe 3 years to do one copy of the Bible. And then along comes this thing, a printing press. Now, most of you probably haven't seen a printing press, but it changed everything. Now, before the movable type one, that's the key issue here, that Gutenberg invented the movable type. Before 1450, there was another type of printing press. And let me just I'm going to make up a story that feels like it's probably true, but don't quote this story in some sort of a history class, because I am making it up in my head, but it's the way that it helps me remember maybe how the printing press came about. So I'm going to say these monks were doing their everyday business, and one of them got a little bit tired or maybe just distracted, and so after lunch he probably asked the head monk if he could maybe go outside and just take a walk in the garden, clear his head a little bit. And so the head guy said, "Oh, certainly, go out there and do some meditation." So he walked out, and there had just been a thunderstorm with thunder and lightning, and he walked over to this tree where a big slab of the tree, a piece of the tree that kind of looks like this but out of wood, had been shorn off of the tree by a bolt of lightning. But lifted up above in the wood, there's just a fragment of other wood kind of embossed above it, and it looked like the letter M. M as in Mary. And the monk was thinking, wow, that's a letter. And if I put ink, if I somehow covered that in ink, and then I pushed down on a piece of paper, it would print that letter over and over, like a stamp that we use today. And he probably tried it, and it worked. So my guess is the first invention of what he did not go well, because he was only using the letter M or the letter W from what he saw in nature. So he probably then took a chisel and a hammer in his spare time, which was not much, so he was giving up sleep. Keyword number 3 is horses. And he chiseled an entire sentence or maybe a paragraph. That could take up to a month to do that in such a way that it was really there. And then he dipped it into ink, just the letterheads into ink, and then pressed it down on a piece of paper, and was probably very disappointed because everything was backwards. Because you see, an M or a W is a perfectly symmetrical matching letter. So if you do it backwards or forwards, it's still going to look the same. Kind of like a palindrome, which is a word that's the same forwards and backwards. Well, a word like mom, you could do that forwards or backwards and it would still say mom. Other palindromes don't work out that way. And then he figured out, oh, I see, because I'm pressing it this way, it's got to be printed or chiseled in reverse. So then he did it in reverse. And then I'm going to make up the story where when he got to the last letter, the chisel slipped and the letter K went off of the paragraph. And there was no way to put it back in, because when you're chiseling, it's like sculpting. You cut away all the material you don't want. Well, when the K letter, which is what he did want, got chopped off, he had to start again. So that's the problem with a fixed type printing press. But no one had thought of anything different. And then this guy Gutenberg comes along and he says, well, what about if I develop a more formal thing than just a piece of wood that we've chiseled into, and we set up each sentence or each row of letters with a separate set of letters and a special way to hold the letters in. So each letter was a separate thing that you placed into the printing press. And if you spelled a word wrong, you could just take out the S and put in the T or whatever it happened to be. That's what movable type was. But just imagine how it changed the world, but especially Europe, where this particular press was invented. it changed it to the degree that you could now probably do a Bible in 4 hours versus 3 years. By the way, the first Bibles printed on the Gutenberg press are known as the Gutenberg Bible. If you ever encounter a Gutenberg Bible, and chances are you won't, they're so rare, but they're extremely valuable. If you encounter one, buy it. Even if they ask for $10,000, buy it, because it's worth millions. I saw on a show, I think it was American Pickers, maybe Pawn Stars, that there's something like 26 that they found, and they think there's about 4 more still somewhere, maybe in an attic in Europe somewhere, or who knows, a safe somewhere like that. So if we discover, I think they're each worth about $4 million right now, so that would be a great thing to have. And it really, really, really changed the world. I just want to tell you a quick story about a printing press. Let me actually see if I can find a video. I don't know if I can find one that's really good. I've not searched for one before, so let's see what we find. Well, we'll just pick the first one and see if this guy tells us anything. I'm not going to play the whole thing.
He just took a bowl, put a handle on it, stuffed it with horsehair, and covered it with, guess what? Gänzefleisch, goose skin. So he finally made use of his thing. I don't know why he used goose skin, but it must have worked really well, because Bibles that are still in existence are just beautiful. I had to soften the paper by dampening it. Now I knew that if he just laid a sheet on like this, just leather over a frame that provides a place for us to put our paper on. These little points called duckbills position it up and down.
Okay, maybe we can see it here.
Carrying it because it's damp. So we're ready to fold the bed of the press under the platen. The next thing that happens is you pull a handle, which turns the screw and lowers the platen and presses the paper against the inky type. The person that did this was called a very exotic name, the puller. So we're going to have some of you guys and gals be pullers. We're going to do 2 impressions. So let's have, why don't you come and do our first impression. 2 hands up there and pull it towards you as
Hard as you can.
To make a good impression.
Don't break it. When President Monson was here, he pulled that thing, and I said, "Don't break it." About brought the house down. He really pulled it though. He moved the press a little bit.
Okay, now notice the size of the platen is really quite small. Because the bigger the platen is, the more power it takes to get sufficient impression. So I just printed the 1 page, so I've got to roll it out and get the other page. Now we'd like to have some of the gals do it. How about? Oh, that sounds pretty good.
It's hard.
Did it?
Yeah, how'd you like to do that all day long?
You'd have some arm muscles.
All right, now we're going to roll it out. Now listen quiet, and then you can hear the frisket lift that paper
This is called
off that sticky
the
top.
press kiss.
Oh boy.
We did pretty good.
Wow.
Did a pretty good inking job and a pretty good pulling job.
Well, I wish he would have showed you the actual print type that they're pressing it into, but you could see by that it was very, very, very small. Let's get back to the notes. But I had an experience in real life. My son used to be a doctor in Boston. He's now in New York City. I think I told you last week. And I visited him often. And Boston's a very historical city. Among many other things, it's a phenomenal city. But a lot of American history unfolded in Boston. So they have a thing called the Freedom Trail, where they have bricks, a brick trail embedded in the sidewalk, just single bricks in line. And then with an app on your phone, you can actually follow the trail and listen to someone describing all the things. I mean, there are cemeteries where you see just lots of founding fathers of our country buried, and all kinds of different historical places where meetings occurred, when we were planning the American Revolution in 1776 and fighting the British. And we eventually got to the North Church, I think it's called. And you may recall the story of Paul Revere, where he was going to ride his horse through the countryside and say that the British were coming. And the instructions were that they were going to put up either one lamp in the church tower or two lamps. One if by land, if the British were attacking by land, and two if by sea. And as soon as Paul Revere and his pals saw the signal, and I don't remember if it was land or sea, but once he saw the signal, he started racing through the countryside yelling, "The British are coming, the British are coming." Well, in the basement of the church today, you can still attend church there. But in the basement, they have a gift shop. And set up in the gift shop is a printing press just like the one you saw. And just something, this is trivia, it doesn't have anything to do with music or our class per se. I just found it to be really interesting. The printing press, again, each letter like you see on your keyboard on your computer, well, they're putting those in line to actually spell out the entire sentence, paragraph, page. Of course, again, they're in reverse. But when I was young, we called capital letters. And if it wasn't a capital letter, it was just called a small letter or a little letter. Usually small letter. Non-capital sometimes. Now it's called uppercase, lowercase. And that sort of came about with the computer. But I was never sure where those terms came from, if they had anything to do with it. But if you can imagine to print that many letters at the same time, they must have had a ton of letters of the same one. So the printer, basically on the right or left of the press, he has this giant box, I'm going to call it a case, but a giant box with 26 compartments in it. And in one of the compartments, the upper left compartment, there's going to be maybe 100 small A's. And then next to that, in the next little spot, 100 small B's, etc., etc., etc. Then on a shelf slightly above and tilted so he could access it better, is another box with 26 compartments. And this would be for the capital letters. So you don't use as many capitals, so maybe he had 40 capital A's, 40 capital B's, 40 capital C's, that sort of a thing. And then he would just place them. Once you got it laid out, you could just start printing away. But the ones that were in that box that's on the lower shelf, or the case, would be the little letters, and that case was the lower case. So those are the lowercase letters. And then the shelf that's slightly above and angled would be the capital letters, which are found in the upper case. Not a big deal. I just find it to be really interesting. If you're ever on Jeopardy or something like that, maybe you can send me some money if you win on a question like that. So with Gutenberg doing this, it just enabled society to change significantly. Now, the next historical thing that happened, I want you to think about world history and the year 1517. Dig down into the deep recesses of your mind. Does anything come to mind? While you're thinking about it, I'll tell you that keyword number 4 is cat. So anything happened, and I'll give you that it's religion oriented. So world religion history. 1517 is when something called the Protestant, let's do it this way. The Protestant Reformation. And that was led by a priest, actually. I'll say Father Martin Luther. And I put the word Protestant with uppercase being the word protest. A lot of people don't actually recognize that the word protest is in the word Protestant. So again, we talked about last week, the only Christian church up until about now would have been the Roman Catholic Church. And Martin Luther was a priest. And sometimes when you see something from the inside as opposed to the outside, you see some deeper issues and maybe some problems. And I'm not saying there were problems in the Catholic Church, but he felt that there were significant problems. And he made a list of all of those problems. You might recall this from some sort of a history class at some point. and those were called his theses. I think he had 95 that he wrote down on a large piece of paper. And then when he finally decided to start this reformation or the reforming of the church, he went to the cathedral door and nailed these to the door. And he probably ran like heck after this because he would be hunted. The Catholic Church did have more power than the government or the police. And they would have captured him just from protesting against the church. The church was considered just to be the way it is, and you never were allowed to speak out against it. They would capture you, possibly imprison you in their own church prisons, possibly put you to death if the thing was egregious enough. And this probably was. But so eventually these other denominational Christian churches were founded. And his name is Martin Luther. So the church he founded was called the Lutheran Church. You've probably heard of it. And that's named after him. I won't go into the list of issues, but there were, again, I believe 95 or 98, something like that. And the most easy one to understand is up until 1517, if you went to a Catholic church, you heard the entire Holy Mass celebrated, they say, or worshipped in the dead language of Latin, not the language that you spoke. It was all done in Latin as part of the tradition. And Martin Luther noticed that there weren't as many people going to church anymore, and it seemed like they'd lost interest because they didn't understand what was going on. And I can even relate to you as a little boy. I went to a Catholic church. The Catholics didn't agree with Martin Luther until 1962 or 63. Up until that time, they kept the Mass pretty much in Latin. And they finally decided they didn't agree with Martin Luther. They just changed it 400 and some years later. But Martin Luther's point was, if you're in Spain, let's worship in Spanish. If you're in Italy, let's worship in Italian. Poland, Polish. Makes good sense, so everyone knows. But I can remember sitting in church as a little boy, and the priest would say a prayer, and everyone would say it with him in unison, and it was in Latin. And I'd look at my dad, and I'd go, what did we just say? And my dad would go, I don't know. And then we'd sing a song, and everyone would sing it together in Latin. I'd say, what's that song? I don't know. So it certainly makes sense to me, but it was those kinds of things. There are many, 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 many more, but that's what Martin Luther did, and it was a really big deal. But it kind of changed society along with the printing press. His heroism or bravery really changed society. So let's listen to the first song that occurred in the... Oh, let me give you your composer, by the way. Your marquee composer for this era is Palestrina. That's pronounced Palestrina. Now let's listen to the first song in this era. Having trouble with the power. Let's see what we can do. It's gone out for a second. Let's see if I can wake it back up. I can't. So I'm going to stop the video for right now. I'm going to do this lecture video in two parts because I can't just pause it. I'm going to have to stop it, and we'll count it as part one. It doesn't mean you have to do any more work. I've just got to split it up into two separate parts. So let me do that now.